Hello and welcome to another opening explorations video, and today we have an introduction to the Caro-Kann exchange variation. So how do you go about trying to figure out what variations to play, what openings to use? Well, that's a good question. One of my viewers asked, and basically you can look at master games, see what they're playing, if you find an opening that you're interested in, and then you just see what variations they play. You can use a games database to see what people are playing the most. So here, the Caro-Kann exchange starts out with e4, c6, and then d4 is most commonly played. So then in the Caro-Kann, black plays d5, attacking the e4 pawn. Now the exchange variation is this move here, capturing the pawn. And normally black will not capture with the queen. We see that move is only played 102 times versus the number one move, which is best, is just to capture with the flank pawn towards the center. So now we have this exchange variation, and we can look at the most common moves played, and they're most common because usually they're the best moves. Now you can pick some moves that are lower down on the list and try and catch your opponent off guard because they won't see those moves as much, and that could be a good strategy. But sometimes the moves that are further down on the list are down there because of a reason, and it's usually because they're not quite as good. But some of them have great surprise factor. Now this is an introduction, so I'll mostly go over the most common moves just so you can become familiar with this opening. Now, with this exchange variation, the position is a little bit more open than some Caro-Kann games. So because there's already been an exchange of pawns, and when a position's a little more open, it's kind of a race to see who can develop their pieces the fastest. And white goes first. So if we look here, the most common move is actually c4. Which is interesting, trying to open the position up even more. So that's what we'll look at first, and we'll see how white follows that up. So c4 is most common in this database. If I had a larger database, we could see even more examples. Now, looks like by far knight to f6 is played most often, just protecting the pawn. And now, white does the same, develops. So we see a race to develop the pieces as fast as you can. Now, most common appears to be e6, so backing up the pawn. And now this bishop will be able to develop, and black can castle quickly here. Knight to f3 because white has to start getting ready to castle as well. And now bishop to b4, pinning the knight. So most commonly played next is capture in the center, and then knight captures is most common, just adding pressure on the pinned piece. So then the bishop breaks the pin, and then we have development by black. Bringing the knight out is most common. And then from here it looks like bishop to d3, centralizing the bishop, aiming at the king side in case black castles there, and readying kingside castling for white as well. So most common is for black to just castle, then white castles, and now let's see, bishop to e7. So just retreating and keeping the bishop pair. So both sides have gone ahead, castled, and They're getting almost all of their pieces developed, their minor pieces here. Black still may have problems with this bad bishop that's blocked in by its own pawn. White has an isolated queen pawn. So in isolated queen pawns, you want to avoid exchanges of material usually if you have the isolated pawn. So black would like to trade off material. So let's see how it continued here. I'll just play this out a few more moves. A3, keeping the knights out of b4. Bishop to f6, adding pressure to the isolated pawn. And now, let's see. Looks like most common is to ignore that by developing the queen. And then we have g6 blocking this attack here. And then, by far, 76 moves versus 3, which is the second move. Well, 3 on the next 2 moves. So the most common move now is this, bishop to h6. So attacking the rook, rook moves, and then rook at a to d1. So I mentioned this before. The sign that you're opening, or one of the signs that you're opening turned out okay, is if you get your rooks developed to good locations. So let's play out a few more moves and see how they get their rooks developed. So capture and then a recapture. So this does get rid of the isolated pawn in the center. Now that pawn that was isolated is fortified by another pawn, but it's in exchange for this isolated pawn on the edge. So now bishop to d7, getting ready to do something with this bishop that is still kind of hemmed in by this pawn. And now queen to d2, just creating a battery with the bishop, and bishop to g7. So now we're getting down to only a few games left. It looks like more common might be, well, only 2 games were played with this move, but white can start attacking possibly. Then we have knight to e7. The other rook is finally developed, and black does likewise with his rook, putting pressure on this backward pawn. And then h5, just pushing forward, attacking, not worrying about this capture here because it would kind of break up the pawns in front of black's king, weakening his position. So now, in this game, the final game that it's showing here, this was played, then capture, knight captures, and c4. So anyway, let's get back to what some of the other variations are that are possible. This is to give you an idea of how the opening might flow into different types of middle games and end games. So I won't go further because I would like to look at some more variations. So if we go back to the beginning, and what do we have here? E4, C6, the Caro-Kann. Then the most common move by far is D4, D5, and once again, the exchange variation, which is the third most played variation by white. So I've gotten good feedback on these opening explorations videos. I've received a little, higher number of views than average. And my channel is fairly new. It's about, a little over a year old. So, and I'm closing in, maybe by the time this video is out, I'm not sure, I may have already hit 1,000 subscribers. So I'm closing in on that goal. So if you know anybody that's into chess, tell them to subscribe and support this channel. And if you have already, I thank you. So here, the exchange variation. Let's get back to this. That is the exchange. You capture, and then by far, usually they'll almost always capture with the pawn. I mean, I guess only 102 times versus 26,000 has the queen captured, But if the queen captures, you can play knight to c3, attacking and chasing the queen, kind of grabbing some initiative there and jumping ahead in development, because that queen will have to take time to run away, and it gives you time to develop another piece. So that's why this is a lot more common. And now black has 2 pawns in the center versus only 1 center pawn for white after this exchange. Now, because these pawns have been exchanged, white does have the use of this half open file, which could be valuable for his rooks or queen to be placed on this half open file. And likewise, black has this half open file, and it's usually a good idea to place the queen or rooks on this half open file and try and get play, some kind of activity possibly down this file. So we looked at that c4 move. I guess I could take one more look at it and see what if there's any less common moves that could be played. So just to recap, this c4 move, and now this transitions into the Panov attack. Maybe we don't want to dig into this variation too much because it's an entirely different variation. But this is what we looked at: knight to f6, and then knight to c3, and another possibility by black is just to bring the other knight out, but then white will just develop as well. We could have a pin, so this is a little bit different. A pin of this knight on the queen. And so, let's see, most common is to capture. Knight captures. And then, and this is interesting, queen to b3 is most commonly played. And then after capture, we have doubling of these pawns on the king side. So white has weakened his pawns on the king side, but maybe this half open file could be used to target black's king if they castle over here on the king side, which is probably more likely because there's a little bit less pawn cover over here on the queen side. So the game usually continues with this move, helping fortify the knight, and then queen captures this pawn, knight captures, let's see, bishop to b5 check, knight captures, and now either the queen captures, but even more common is this move. So that's interesting because now the king has to move. The queen cannot block or the rook will be picked off. So let's see. King to e7 has to be played. And now the queen captures anyway, but the king is stuck in the center here, which could be dangerous. So now queen to d7, trying to trade off queens. Knight captures. Let's see. Queen captures. And then an exchange of queens, leaving black with this passed pawn, but it is isolated. And isolated pawns, after a lot of material is traded off, they're harder to protect. So white develops another piece, which is always important when the position is wide open like this. So the winner will probably be whoever gets their pieces developed, quickly. So the king moves forward. We have castling along, which now that brings the rook to the center and gets the king a little bit safer and connects the rook. So that move did a lot. Bishop to b4, just developing, connecting the rooks. King over to b1. And then we have, let's see, rook at h to d8, protecting the past isolated pawn here. Rook up to d3, and let's see, rook to d7, preparing to double the rooks. White moves here, grabbing the open file, and now black usually lines up here, maybe with the idea of, well, lining up on the king, possibly putting pressure on this pawn in the future. Now rook checks, king up to f5. Centralizing the king in the endgame is always a valuable or important thing to do. All right, well, before we dig too crazy into that, let's go back here and look at the main possibilities. Other than that, we kind of veered off into the Panov attack, which is, after the exchange variation here, is that move. So we don't want to go into this Panov attack. We want to look at more of the normal exchange variation options, which the second best move here is bishop to d3, or the second most played move, and this keeps us in the exchange variation. But I wanted to show you that c4 move because in the exchange variation, it looks like most often white will go into that Panov attack. So that's something you should be aware of if you're thinking about playing the exchange variation as black. All right, so e4, c6, d4, d5. We exchange the pawns, and now bishop to d3 is played. What does this move do? Well, it centralizes the bishop. It's keeping an eye on these two diagonals, but it is, a valuable diagonal here aimed at black's king side. So if the king castles over here, which he's most likely to do, this bishop will be ready to assist with an attack, possibly. All right, so now let's see. Knight to c6 is most common, maybe threatening to come down and attack the bishop. So c3 is played. And of course, this knight is under attack. So, if we go back and, what if the knight here is played? Knight to c3, and you think, oh, maybe I can pick off this knight here. Well, you have to watch out. If one of their pieces lands here, trying to capture this pawn, and this bishop moves with a check, there's a discovered attack by the queen, and so the queen could pick off a piece. If this knight captures, and then, well, I take that back, because here, if the bishop moves, the knight can just jump back there and capture that bishop. But if the queen were to come down here, and if we had a knight here in an exchange and the queen ends up here, you have to just watch out and be aware of a bishop check and a discovered attack by the queen if there's a piece sitting here on d4. But anyway, back to what is normally played. c3. So this fortifies this pawn, prevents the bishop from the knight from harassing your bishop. I need to learn how to talk today. Okay, so knight to f6 is most commonly played. So a race to get the pieces developed. Now, most common is bishop to f4. Then bishop to g4, which is interesting, attacking the queen. It could provoke white to play f3, but that's only played 36 times, and it looks like white does not win very often, only 11% win ratio, because that would kind of, it keeps pieces out of e4 and g4, but it does create a little weakness here, and takes away the good square of f3 for your knight. So most commonly played is queen to b3. So targeting this pawn, on b7, which is unprotected. And so here most common is queen to d7, protecting the pawn, backing the bishop up, and creating a little battery here. So now, let's see, knight to d2 to prevent, if you move knight to f3, they could capture and wreck your kingside pawns. So that's most likely why this move is played, to avoid that. And already we're down into only a handful of games. So interesting. Oh, excuse me. I played the wrong move. Knight to e2 is only played 6 times. So, knight to e2, it looks like, yeah, with that, black wins 67% of the time. And the last, other than that, 33% is a draw. So probably why that move is normally played. So knight to d2 is what we want to look at. And now the most common move is that, letting the bishop out. Now why is this knight to d2 move played? Because now the knight can move up here and not be afraid if the bishop captures, because now the knight can recapture and you don't have to double your pawns up. So after this move to release the bishop, we have knight moving up to f3, and now capture, getting rid of the bad bishop. Knight recaptures. And this is interesting. The most commonly played move is centralizing the bishop here and attacking. But the only thing I don't like about that is that white could capture, then the queen will have to capture, and then white can just pick off this pawn, but the rook could attack and then grab this pawn. So anyway, we'll take a look at it. Let's see how it plays out. So bishop attacks our bishop. So now we give up our bad bishop for their good one. Queen recaptures. White goes ahead and castles. So it's not very common for the queen to capture this pawn up here on b7. Instead, we just capture or castle. So apparently this is a better move. Get your king castled, get your rooks into the game. So black does likewise, tempting white again to pick off this pawn. And of course, white does not do that. Because then you could just have a counter attack. You attack the queen and then come down here and land a rook on the 7th rank. So rook at a to e1 is normally played. So this is interesting. Why block in your rook here on f1? Well, maybe the plan is to push this f pawn in the future. So let's see what the most common moves are. Queen to c7, kind of lining up on this half open file and finally protecting the b7 pawn. Then queen to c2, creating a battery with the bishop lining up on this pawn. So g6 is played most often. Now queen to d2, maybe trying to take advantage of the weakness on the dark squares. King up to g7 to keep the queen out. Knight grabs an outpost, and black immediately gets rid of that knight. And then we have this capture here. So now we might see why this rook was left here, because most likely this pawn at some point is going to march up here, push forward to back this pawn up, and then this rook will be backing up that pawn. So I'll play this out a little bit further. Knight retreat, putting pressure on the pawn. Queen to f4 instead of pushing the pawn. So let's go back. The second most played move is f4, but it looks like black won that game. So instead, this move is played, and Let's see how it continues. Black got a draw against Hikaru Nakamura by playing, let's see, king to g8 here. So, that's interesting. And then after queen to g5, we have queen to d8 attacking the queen. And then queen to h6. And that's as far as the game, or as far as the info that they have here. But a draw happened against Hikaru Nakamura with black in that variation. So anytime you can achieve a draw against Hikaru Nakamura, whoever you are, that's good, unless you're Magnus Carlsen or the top players in the world. Then you may go for a win. All right. Well, let's go back here. Take a few more, look at a few more variations that are possible in this Caro-Kann exchange variation. So we took a look at, let's see, the exchange here, and then c4, which was the Panov attack. Bishop to d3, we'll take one more look at that to see what other possibilities there are. So bishop to d3 is played most often. We looked at knight to c6, the most common move, and then c3 is played. But what if they play the second most played move, knight to f6? So what does that do? Well, it develops more quickly the king side, so maybe black can get castled faster. It helps protect this h-pawn in case there's pressure on that in the future. It eyes the e4 square and guards your central pawn. Once again, looks like c3 is played most often to back up this central pawn. And then looks like we're almost transposing back into something similar with this knight on c6. But now, let's see, bishop to f4, bishop to g4. So it's looking similar to what we saw before. Queen attacking up here, queen to d7, and knight to d2. So a similar kind of thing where this knight develops first, then the other knight can develop and not worry about it being captured. So e6, knight develops, bishop captures, knight captures, and the same kind of thing, bishop to d6. All right, well, this is similar to what we just saw. So let's go back and see what other options there are after the exchange. We looked at the c4 move, which is the Panov attack, and then bishop to d3. So the third possibility is knight to f3 first. Well then, it looks like knight to c6. And after c3, we're kind of getting back into a similar theme here. Both knights develop. There's a possibility of the pin on the knight. So probably have to watch out for that. Bishop to d3. Pin on the knight. And now this pin takes place before this bishop is developed. But the queen is still guarding. So it looks like most commonly played is kingside castling. Then e6 to get the other bishop out. And then you get this bishop out of here to be able to bring the other knight up. Bishop to e7, breaking this pin. Knight develops. And then black goes ahead and castles most often here. Rook grabs the half open file, and then let's see here. Black normally retreats here. Bishop backing up. That way the pawn won't be able to chase it away possibly. now queen to c2, because this knight on d2 is backing up the knight on f3, and the queen is relieved of that guard duty. So now bishop swings back, preventing this attack, this battery that's lining up on the h7 pawn. And normally there's an exchange here. So, capture towards the center. What have you succeeded in doing here? You've doubled up black's pawns. But now there's this half-open file leading to white's king side. But h3 could be played to kind of prevent anything building up there, which it doesn't look like that's happening anytime soon. But in the game example that we have, knight to e5 is played. Rook takes the half-open file. So remember, one of the key factors in determining if your opening turned out okay or not is to see how your rooks end up coming out of the opening. And also there's a little trick here, possibly. The rook lined up on this queen, and if the knight captures here, this pawn can't recapture, or the queen will be picked off by the rook. So let's see here. Looks like f4 was played in this game. So did they not see the little attack here? Let's see. Maybe they missed it, because now we have a capture. The queen, okay, the queen can recapture, but black succeeded in picking off a valuable central pawn. Now retreat, then after capture, rook captures, and apparently the queen does not pick off that pawn there. So in the game we had this, and now here they just protect that pawn by pushing it forward. Queen back to d1, and black is just ahead here, and they went on to win. All right, so I guess I could play this out a little bit further. Attacking the bishop, we exchange, but exchanges are fine with black because they're ahead in material, ahead by a pawn. Let's see, how does it go from here? Queen develops, and now we have queen to h4 lining up on the king. Rook up to e5. Knight repositions back to the center, and rook to g5. That's interesting. All right, well, I don't want to dig too deeply into all these games, since this is supposed to be an opening video about the exchange variation, which one more time, the exchange variation is e4, c6. That's the Caro-Kann. d4, d5 is played most often. And then the exchange happens here in the center. Recapture. And, is there anything else we need to look at? The fourth most played move is c3. But that kind of, continues our theme of playing c3 to protect the d pawn. And then, let's see, most often is the knights being developed. The bishop comes out early most of the time in this position. Now this other knight won't be blocked if it has to go, or excuse me, now the knight can move to d2 and not block the bishop from developing. So, maybe it's good to get this bishop out early, control this diagonal here. And now, let's see, likewise, black does the same. So here we have knight to f3. So this position is a little bit different. e6, the bishop is outside of the pawn chain, this bad bishop, blocked by its pawns on the same color squares. And once again, a common theme, putting the queen here on b3 and attacking this unprotected pawn. But, usually white doesn't get this pawn. We have queen to d7 guarding the pawn, knight to d2, and f6 here. So that's something a little different. Bishop to e2, because of course you can't go here with this bishop covering that. So now this bishop could retreat and maybe swing back here, but let's see what normally happens. Played most often is, black's turn, g5 here, chasing our bishop. So the bishop retreats, and then we have h5, threatening to trap the bishop. And now, almost evenly played is h3 or h4, and it looks like white wins more often with the h4 move. So, I don't know, maybe we take a look at both of these variations. So, because h3 was played a little bit more, we'll see that. We'll take a look at that first. So, h3, then what? Knight at g to e7. Knight to f1. So that's interesting. Maybe getting ready to reposition here and chase the bishop. Bishop to e4. Knight, already decided to go here to a3, so you might as well continue with your plan. And then knight to f5. Knights are exchanged, but the pawn captures, opening a line up here, opening the e-file. And now we have, let's see, knight to d2. That's interesting. Attacking. So, of course, the bishop grabs that unprotected pawn. Rook to g1. Okay, this is probably why black won this game, because now it's, these moves are not looking like the best moves, maybe. So here, black goes ahead. White's turn. White castles. Could they have gone here? No, the bishop could swing over here, maybe. I was wondering if that bishop could be trapped. All right, anyway, no, you have this possibility as well. So f4, now the bishop can escape. The bishop retreats. This one moves up here, attacking down through the king position. And queen to a4, kind of pinning the knight a little bit to the queen. The knight can still move. And then castling as well on the queen side. All right, so this gives you another idea of how things could go. Let me go back a little bit further to this h3 move. And normally, white wins with this h4 move instead. So most often played is that. Now this knight is stuck moving down to this awful square. Knight at g to e7. H to f1 knight. Bishop grabbing this open diagonal. Knight blocks the diagonal. And now this bishop retreats, maybe getting ready to push pawns forward. And what do we have next? Queen to a3. Interesting move. I mean, I guess you're lining up on this diagonal, possibly, if the... I don't know about this move. I guess it gets out of the way of pushing the pawns, maybe, or allowing the knight to jump here to b3 and then attack the queen. Let's see how it played out. So e5, knight to b3. Okay, that must have been the reason. Getting ready to attack the queen. So b6 is played to prevent the knight moving forward. And then we have capture. Capture towards the center. Rook to d1. Queen to e6, getting off the line of fire of this rook. And then finally, oh, excuse me, white's turn. White castles. Bishop captures. Pawn recaptures, leaving an isolated pawn here. Knight attacks that. And now, the rook captured. Yeah, I guess if the bishop tried to come down here, this pawn could attack. So yeah, this looks like, well, white did win here. So let's see. We'll go a little bit further and see how white won this game. Bishop to a6 was played next by white. All right. Maybe threatening to fork these pieces, although the knight is protected. Rook to d8. Now the bishop repositions, pinning the knight. d4. Getting rid of the isolated pawn. e4. Now there's a passed pawn. The fork. But, the rook can just capture. And now the queen the knight is attacking the queen and the knight that is pinned. So black gives back material, but the rook captures. The passed pawn is on the run, but this bishop is guarding the queening square. Now what? Rook to d6. Okay, and then we're forking the knight and the queen here, and it's not looking too good. So we have that. Capture. And, ooh, yeah, it's looking dangerous here. The queen is forced to give itself up because of the threat of this queen jumping in with an attack on the king that's stuck in the center. So, yeah, be careful with that. In an exchange variation in this Caro-Kann, when things are a little bit more open, whoever gets their pieces out the fastest and gets the king to safety and they're able to attack, especially if your opponent leaves their king in the center, it can be very dangerous. So, the pawn tries to move forward, but there's not much. How did this game go? Yeah, they gave up after this. They're threatening a mate up here, possibly. Yeah. So I guess the bishop could try and retreat back and block the line on the 7th rank. But still, it is looking bad with that king stuck out in the middle. All right, well, let me make sure I didn't miss anything. So in the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, we have this. And I'll do future videos with other variations. Probably the next video will be the main line of the Caro-Kann, which, I should have a lot more to cover in that. After the exchange, the exchange occurs with the trading of these pawns. So the open E file for white, or half open E file, and the half open C file for black. So, play might continue where black tries to use this open C file for the rook and maybe the queen, and white will see if they can use this half open file by putting a rook, and possibly the queen on this half open file. So we looked at C4, which goes into the Panov attack, but the main line in the exchange variation, or the one that's played the most, is bishop to d3 here. Knight to f3 can be played, or c3, but those different moves could transpose into the main line. One thing we didn't really look at is this immediate bishop to f4, I guess. And then once again, it looks like common moves by black, bringing this bishop up. And then most often played is c3, once again keeping the knight out of b4 fortifying the central pawn. And then it's looking, kind of like similar stuff here. We get our bishops out of the bad bishops out of the pawn chain. Although, since this e pawn is gone, it's easier to get their bishop out. Where black has to get their bishop out before they push this pawn to e6. So white usually plays knight to f3, then we have e6, and once again, that queen move attacking here. So queen to d7. Second most common is queen to c8, so I guess that's a possibility as well. But d7 gets the queen off the back rank. So the other knight develops. Then once again, this f6 move. Looks like we could have the knight developing. Bishop develops. White is ready to castle. Queen side or king side. So the knight develops with an attack, but the bishop can just retreat. Then this bishop develops, and here we have an exchange. So now looks like we're running out of games here. 50-50 here is the g3 move. What does that do? It keeps this knight out of the position, holds this knight back. Black usually castles here, then white castles. Let's see, a6. And, the queen doesn't go after this pawn because the rook could attack the queen. And now, after this move, the queen could be trapped. Yeah, it looks like the queen would be trapped if she goes after this poisoned pawn here. So, a4 is played to prevent the b5 pawn push gaining space on the queen side. So now, knight to a5. You don't normally want to put your knight on the edge of the board, but here you're attacking the queen. So after the queen runs, we have, you could exchange off, but in this game, black wanted to keep the queen. But this does allow now the knight to be attacked. Instead of jumping here, which wouldn't be too good, there'd be an exchange. Black continues the theme of trying to avoid trading of pieces. So now a5 just grabs more space, and e5. So what we mentioned, well, I don't know if I mentioned this, but white, could try and get play down the e file. So black pushes this pawn to open the e file up. Because with this pawn here on e6, it kind of restricts black's position a little bit more, especially if a knight were to be able to jump up in here. At least black is doing a good job with both of his knights and the queen covering this e5 square. So, another thing, when you're transitioning from an opening into the middle game, you want to start looking for pawn levers or opportunities to push pawns to attack or open the position to give more freedom for your pieces so they have more mobility. So, most commonly played is just a capture, and then knight captures, and now instead of trading material, jump to a better square and attack the bishop. So here the bishop comes down attacking the rook grabs the open file, and now we have rook at f to e8 fighting for this open file. And here's where the game ended in this database. So, what could happen here? Maybe the bishop could move here and fight, try and control these squares around the king. So the bishop could drop back, so the rook could try and fight for this open file. Although, the bishop, And the knights are helping as well to keep this knight from moving forward into the position. Now the knight could move here, so maybe the bishop wants to stay there until they get rid of this knight. So maybe f4 is possible to chase this knight away. All right, well, let's go back a little bit and make sure there's nothing else to look at. So after the exchange, we looked at the c4 Panov attack. The second most common move, bishop to d3, which looks to be the main line exchange variation. Knight to f3 is possible here, c3, and then we looked at bishop to f4. So after that, you're looking at less and less common moves. So looks like bishop to d3 in the exchange variation is what you'll see most often if they don't want to go into that Panov attack with c4, with the pawn pushing up to c4. So it looks like black knight to c6 is played most often, and then the game is pretty even. 33% win rate for white, 31 for black, and a draw 36% of the time. So the Caro-Kann is a pretty solid defensive structure or defensive opening. If maybe you're playing a higher rated player and you just want to keep things real solid and avoid too much craziness, you could play the Caro-Kann. And it looks like knight to c6 is best because you're attacking, you're forcing white to do something, prevent you from harassing the bishop or even taking this pawn, which if they take that pawn, you can't check with the bishop right away, because then the knight here, if it takes the pawn on d4, it can swing back and capture your bishop. But if the knight jumps to f3 and the queen goes to b6 and you start exchanging, things could turn out badly if the queen is stuck here and then you check with a discovered attack. So just keep that in mind. All right, anyway, c3 is played most often here, which avoids any of that future mess. So here we have knight to f6 being played most often. Queen to c7 is the second most played move. And then with that, they recommend playing this. So that's interesting. Bishop pins, and then that's ignored for castling. e6 to get the other bishop out. And here, queen to e1, breaking the pin of that knight. Breaking the pin of this knight on the queen. And now the queen is lined up on the king on this open file. And here, black usually gets rid of their bad bishop for that knight. So queen captures. That does help develop the queen on this half open file, which white, may try and take advantage of in this opening by putting the queen and the rook here. Whereas, as I mentioned, black might try and take advantage of this half open file. So we'll play this out a little bit further. Oh, wrong piece. Most often played is that, lining up here on h3. So g3 to block that attack. And now immediately h5, threatening to pry open this h file. Knight develops, h4 is played, knight developing even further and unblocking the bishop, and capture. And here, capture towards the center. Now we have this open file. Black castles queen side, so the rooks can try and funnel down this h file towards white's king. And it looks like, after this move, let's see how it goes. Knight to f6, connecting the rooks, developing the knight. Bishop develops, pinning it to the rook. That's ignored, and the king swings over, getting off of this open or half open file. Rook attacks, and rook to the center here. So avoiding the trade. So pretty interesting. Another way that this exchange variation can play out. Okay, well, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments with whatever you would like to discuss. And thank you for watching. Have a super chess day.